This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
There were giants in the earth in those days and also after that. That's a well-known line from Genesis chapter 6, but it turns out that the history of language points to a common source for that story and the stories that we find scattered across cultures, throughout cultures across the world. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert, a special video interview this week as we discuss one of my favorite subjects. Once I got a review on this podcast from somebody who claimed that I was obsessed with the Nephilim, and I suppose that's true, but it's not a bad thing, as the reviewer suggested. It's because those giants, those mighty men who were of old, have played such an important role in the history of the world and the theology of you, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ. Joining us with some new information on the Nephilim, the Rephaim, and how their influence has spread to cultures throughout the world is our friend who's also made a study of these long ago mighty men. He did his doctoral thesis on the religious history of Panias, or Banias, more recently the name. He's also the author of Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim, and a new paper called The War of the Worlds, God Kings and Their Titles, a preliminary report on the linguistic relationship between the Rephaim and royal titles in Eurasian languages. We'll break that down over the course of this conversation with our friendly neighborhood PhD, Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, it's good to see you again, brother.
Good to see you, Derek.
This is fascinating stuff. One of the most jaw-dropping moments for me over the last 5 years was finding the paper by the Estonian scholar Dr. Amar Annus, who has done such incredible work in this field, showing the etymological link, the linguistic connection between the Semitic root behind the word Rephaim and the Greek term morpheme anthropoi, which was the term used by the poets Hesiod and Homer to describe the demigods who lived during the age of Kronos, the golden age when Kronos ruled in heaven. So from a Christian or Jewish perspective, those demigods, those morpheme anthropoi, the Rephaim, were the Nephilim, the half-human, half-divine hybrids who populated the earth before the flood. But you found another etymological connection, another linguistic connection that goes even deeper.
Yes, and Dr. Anus's work has really been kind of a revelation for all of us who do work in this field. And I began to wonder if there were other linguistic connections, because words are, they carry a lot of culture with them. They are culture in many ways. They carry ideas, they carry history, they carry all the minute details, that make navigation within a particular society possible. And, words and languages change. They're not static entities, as historical linguists will tell us. And, I began to wonder about the possibilities after really in the middle of the night about a week ago, I guess about a week and a half ago now. I was joking with another host that I didn't have Akkadian grammars piled up on my desk or articles or anything, or 500 windows open on my computer, but I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about being in a lecture hall talking to my students in my world civilization classes and trying to explain the way that words and language change, particularly within the scope of the Indo-European languages, the languages, or at least a substantial portion of the language families in Europe and in Asia. And invariably, the word that I would always use, or at least start with, was the word for king. And Indo-European is a concept in language studies that sort of goes back to the 19th century. And actually, scholars began to posit that there was a Proto-Indo-European tongue, a sort of mother tongue of Eurasia, that originated somewhere between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and sort of this would be the sort of people are familiar with the Caucasus mountain range, would sort of be the north-south axis to that. And you could even include portions of eastern Turkey and northern Mesopotamia in part of that. And so this was the Proto-Indo-European heartland for all intents and purposes. And the waves of migration of peoples that broke away from this region, ended up in different parts of Eurasia. And they took their language with them. Well, the wave that ended up in India, for instance, the word for king that they used was Rajan. By comparison, another wave that ended up in the Italian peninsula, their word for king was Rex. And you have other later tribes that would carry similar roots. For instance, the Gothic tongues that the Alans and the Sarmatians and of course, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths that people will be familiar with, their word for king was Rex. And so you have and even in Romance languages like Spanish, you have words like rey, and in French, it's roi for king. And in English, we retain words like royal and regal, which are borrowed words from Latin and the Romance languages. So you've got what would essentially be a morphemic continuity between these words for king. And this is just a smattering, of course. But these are the kind of exercises that I would do to illustrate these things to my students, since we were largely dealing with the old world in those classes. But just as a footnote to that for listeners, a morpheme is basically the smallest component of a word that you can break words down into components beyond their syllabic value, and this is a morpheme. And you could sort of play loose and fast with the vowels, but you've got this R vowel morpheme that's continuous. It shows up again and again in these words for king. Now, the other thing that I thought about at 3 o'clock in the morning was all of the work that you had done, that Mike Kaiser had done, that Dr. Arnous, that you mentioned a moment ago, had done in the Semitic, ancient Near Eastern context. And it occurred to me that these words for Rephaim, or words that were related to Rephaim, all shared both idiom and similar construct as well. For instance, the Akkadian Rap and Rabu, and the Ugaritic material, the Rap and Rapi. So I began to wonder, because languages share words all of the time, and diffusion is it's a cultural invariant as far as a mechanism goes for developing culture. And the Indo-European and the ancient Near Eastern and even the Proto-Semitic language world were proximate. And in fact, we know that that the Sumerians, for instance, who were the mother culture of Mesopotamia, were not indigenous to the ancient Near East. Scholars have posited that they actually came from this Proto-Indo-European homeland, so that continuity may go back farther than is, on the surface what we thought. But so I wrote all this down in my phone, and I thought, if I'm going to hit this, I need to finish off my sleep for the night, I think. So I got up the next day and hit the ground running, and I wondered if, sort of going along this track, still trying to wrap my brain around this, and also digging out my old linguistics books, by the way, I wondered if I could do a survey of languages, words for king or ruler in languages in Europe and Asia, and see if there was any continuity. And I was astounded by the occurrence of that continuity.
So this just to summarize, then this section, this morpheme, the R root or this rabba rap which sort of transmogrified over the years into
Right.
the words that we're more familiar with from the Western European languages like Rex and Rakes and Ray and Roy and Royal. You're suggesting that there is a common origin.
Yes, I am. And even within the Semitic context, the morpheme is the continuous morpheme is still the R vowel morpheme. The AP or the AB, as Dr. Anus and you and a number of others have pointed out, is a reference, likely a reference to the abyss, the apsu, which of course, again, that consonant sound, you can, it's made with the same part of the mouth. One is hard, one is soft, so it's essentially the same thing. But yes, I'm asserting that just using basic historical linguistics, that there appears to be a connection.
So this Transcaucasus region, then today, as we look at a map, would be Georgia, Azerbaijan, and the areas to the north there, the Russian areas of was it Chechnya to the north there, and some of those regions.
Even parts of the Ukraine.
Okay.
Essentially, what Indo-Europeanists would have called the kind of the homeland of the Kurgan culture, which was again, it was the general culture associated with this Proto-Indo-European language that linguists had posited.
So this appears to be then some kind of a ground zero for this term that we apply across a multitude of cultures, both Indo-European and Semitic, to those who rule over others.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and particularly when you take the Proto-Indo-European heartland and the Proto-Semitic ancient Near East, conceivably using the same kind of mathematics that linguists do to reconstruct languages like Proto-Indo-European, because it's essentially a reverse engineered language. Of course, it's with a high probability of this language actually, or at least mutually intelligible dialects of this language being spoken by large numbers of people, conceivably because of the proximity of the Proto-Semitic and Proto-Indo-European worlds. A shared language between those two groups could conceivably have existed as well before either one of them.
So what is the origin then of this term? What inspired this term that has been so persistent? I mean, because we're looking back now over a period of 5,000-6,000 years of recorded history?
Right. Well, when you apply the biblical worldview to this, I think inevitably, because language, and words are such anchors to meaning, that you inevitably end up back with the Rephaim, that generation of giants, particularly the post-flood giants just after the flood. You sort of reboot, the political and religious systems of the Watchers and the Nephilim in the pre-flood world. And interestingly enough, when you note that the first civilizations, the earliest civilizations were almost without fail these theocratic monarchies with these autocratic rulers who either identified themselves as gods or some sort of semi-divine messenger or or go between the world of the gods and the world of men. And this really fits the character makeup of what we know about the Rephaim. Our first reference to the Rephaim in the Old Testament is in Genesis 14, where we have this depiction of a war between an eastern coalition of kings, one of whom actually has this morpheme in his name, Amraphel, and which is similar to the morpheme in Hammurabi's name as well, as you and others have pointed out. And then you have this coalition situated, just on the other side of the Dead Sea, or in the vicinity of the Dead Sea. And in the context of that discussion is the mention of the Rephaim, and which may leave room for some of these kings of this Dead Sea region coalition being Rephaim themselves. So you've got this, and if time permitted, we could spin the globe and talk about all the god kings whom societies and civilizations thought began their very cultures. But it's interesting that we also have some character sketches in the Old Testament of Rephaim kings. Og of Bashan is probably the most famous one. You could probably add Sihon to that list, but clearly, Og, within the parameters of the Amorites, Og was this overpowering, usurping god king amongst men. Perhaps he's perhaps a long-lived one, because most of the information we have about him comes from the conquest era. But again, when you're looking at the Genesis 14 material, that's the patriarchal period. That's the time of Abraham. So we're talking, maybe as far back as 2000, 1900 BC. But the pattern, the archetype, if you will, for this usurping god king seems to be clearly linked to the Rephaim. Not only in terms of what we find in the Bible, but if my hypothesis holds true, then that idea, that concept of the god king, of the usurping autocrat, is almost a product of a cultural engineering, which would also be in line, in terms of manipulation and deception, would also be in line with the demonic realm, with the machinations of the pre-flood watchers and the Nephilim, and then the giant tribes that followed in the wake of the flood.
This is one of the reasons I find this so fascinating, that the Rephaim in Genesis 14, so in the days of Abraham and Lot, they were considered to be living tribes. Genesis 14 tells us that the Eastern Coalition defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and we know where that is. That's in modern-day Syria, just across the border from Israel and Jordan, a little bit to the northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Then we've got the Zuzim in Ham and the Emim and Shava Kiriathaim. Those are the names that were given to the Rephaim tribes by the later Ammonites and Moabites, who drove them out the rest of the way. Then when you read the military, the account of this military action, you can see that this Eastern Coalition came down essentially the King's Highway to the east of the Dead Sea, made a loop around the Dead Sea, went down as far south as Eilat on the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, came up the west side where they defeated the Amorites at El Paran, which is, El Paran in the border of the wilderness, turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, defeated all the country of the Amalekites and the Amorites dwelling in Hazazon Tamar, which is En Gedi on the west side of the Dead Sea. So they made a loop around the Dead Sea and essentially decimated the Rephaim tribes there. And then we read later in Genesis that the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites basically cleaned out the rest. But God then saw fit after this to completely obliterate the city of Sodom. Now, the work of Dr. Stephen Collins from Trinity Southwest University over the last 15 years, it appears that Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain were located to the northeast of the Dead Sea, not the southeast as we've been traditionally taught. So there was a loop around the Dead Sea, back to the north where the battle was taking place, across from Jericho. So that was apparently God's way of getting rid of these God kings, or those who followed the God kings in the days of Abraham. And by the time of Moses, the only one left, according to Exodus and Deuteronomy, was Og of Bashan. It was the last of the remnant of the Rephaim. The question here, Judd, is how did this concept or these entities survive the flood? I ask this because of some research I've done on the Ubaid and the Uruk cultures in Mesopotamia. So this would cover the period roughly 6,000 BC down to about 3,000 BC. Uruk dominated from southeast Iraq. Uruk dominated the Fertile Crescent as far north as Turkey. Between roughly 4,000 and 3,000 BC, the Ubaid culture preceded that. The dates differ. Archaeologists aren't, these are not firm, but they do agree, it seems, that there was an increasing stratification of society through the Ubaid culture that really accelerated during the Uruk period, where you had, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. It went from being essentially an egalitarian, agrarian society. Everybody went out, farmed, came home, and you didn't really have that ruling class or political elite or priestly class ruling over everyone else. But by the time the Uruk period arrived, you did have that. You had these big temples in the cities and a priestly class communing with the gods and telling people how they were supposed to live. So there appears to have been some sort of shift that took place during those civilizations that continued down to the time that we're talking about now, the period of the patriarchs. How did that survive the flood?
Well, it survived the flood. That political system survived the flood because there were giants after the flood. And there are some interesting passages about, whether people subscribe to, the genetic theory that somehow that Nephilim DNA, was carried on the ark somehow, or, a second incursion or whatever, by whatever means. Whether it was part of their makeup or not, especially if they were taught this second generation of giants in the post-flood era, if they were taught by, other members of this coup against Yahweh, what is clear is that they're using the same cultural, I guess you could say, culturally weaponized elements that were used by the Watchers and the Nephilim in the pre-flood world. And there's certainly changes that can be quantified during the Neolithic period, which encompasses the Ubaid culture. There are these significant cultural shifts that are taking place because it's all in the wake of the advent of agriculture. And where I was going a moment ago was that there are some interesting passages in apocryphal literature, such as I believe it's in Jasher, that talks about Arphaxad recovering the knowledge of the Watchers from rocks that knowledge had been written onto. So by whatever means, whether it was innately known by this sort of reboot of giant kind, or it was reacquired, it was certainly utilized and weaponized, and this became, and this is an important point, this sort of autocracy, this theocratic monarchy, was just the initial phase. When you consider the scope of world history, governments like constitutional republics like our own are the incredible exception to the rule rather than the rule itself. Most societies that reach the population density and the geographical sprawl to become city-states and nation-states are ruled over by kings, and that those societies are usually lopsidedly stratified, with the haves at the top and the have-nots comprising the rest. And again, I suspect that this goes back to this model that we can chart linguistically, archaeologically, and then historically when writing systems are developed. It begins in this Neolithic period. You mentioned the Ubaid culture and Uruk in particular. We typically associate, monuments like ziggurats with the later Mesopotamian civilizations, particularly the Sumerians. But the Sumerians were not the first to build ziggurats. The Ubaid culture introduced that. And when you consider the significance of the spiritual significance of ziggurats within the scope of Mesopotamian religion, that becomes very interesting, because that may be another point of connectivity between this Watcher Rephaim connection and the introduction of monuments like the ziggurats.
So where did the Sumerians originate? I mean, did they come in and displace the Ubaid culture?
Well, my sense of the matter is that the Sumerians who refer to themselves actually as the Kian-Gir in their early phase, their Semitic contemporaries, the Akkadians, were the ones that gave them the name Shemer. Kian-Gir means something like the black-headed people, and that's an allusion to the fact that most people from that Caucasus region had either black or dark brown hair. They typically had brown eyes. They had not exactly pale skin. It was a little darker toned, but that's an allusion back to that region that they initially came for. Now, my sense of the matter is that as they migrated down through eastern Turkey and into Mesopotamia, is that, as one would expect, they were affected by the cultures that they encountered. Now, waves of this migration may in fact have been, the Ubaid and the earlier phase of Neolithic culture there, but certainly if they maintained a kind of cultural cohesion, then they would have arrived not unaffected by the peoples that they encountered.
So this is really, I think people really need to understand the implications here, because we've been taught that Sumer was the cradle of civilization. The oldest cities are to be found in southeastern Iraq. Eridu, according to one Sumerian text, Nippur, according to another, Kish, according to another, were the oldest cities, the first cities. The oldest ziggurat, or oldest temple discovered in Mesopotamia, is the temple of Enki at Eridu, which was once on the shore of the Persian Gulf, but because of siltation over the years, it's now quite a ways inland. But still, southeastern Iraq was where we find these old temples going back to, according to the scholars, 5,000 BC or thereabouts, which is well before, again, that's in the Ubaid culture. Eridu was considered ground zero for the Ubaid culture. That's quite a ways from the Caucasus Mountains in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Chechnya, and those regions far to the north. So they had to go through a lot of territory to get there. And there are a number of cultures, as you point out in your paper, and as we've learned from other scholars that claim origin, or again, Proto-Indo-European is to have begun there. I've been doing some reading about the Hurrian culture recently in connection with a book that I'm working on. The Hurrians were an Indo-European people who settled in what is now mainly the Kurdish regions of northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey. But they had influence as far south as, well, the Levant, actually. There's some really good evidence that the the gentleman from whom David bought the threshing floor on Mount Moriah, Araunah, that is actually a Hurrian word that means Lord. He could have been the king of the Jebusite city and apparently had a Hurrian name or title. So you had more of an admixture of Indo-European, or let's say descendants of Japheth, Japhethites and Shemites, Semites living in Mesopotamia than we realize, which gets back to the point of your paper that we can trace this influence of the Rephaim into Indo-European cultures as well. So what do we draw from that? I mean, are stories like Jack and the Beanstalk ultimately at their heart inspired by dimly remembered tales of these giants?
Well, one has to wonder, again, language is sort of the ocean that culture floats in. And if a concept like a king or ruler can remain or can retain a structure that's not only contiguous but also connected in some way with the Rephaim god kings of the ancient world, and I would argue even the prehistoric world, then that's a pretty stark testimony about the power of those memories to survive in language. And you have to remember that this is just one word, and it's relevant to our study because we're interested in the stratagems, as it were, of the demonic realm.
Mm-hmm.
You can do this, of course, with all kinds of core words like political words and place words and kinship words. Those are the kinds of things that you're going to find this sort of continuity in. But it's rather astonishing to find this this remnant morpheme that survives for thousands of years with an idiom that clearly lines up with the usurping and autocratic nature of the Rephaim.
You mentioned earlier in this discussion the link between this morpheme behind the Semitic word that developed into the Hebrew Rephaim and the ancient Semitic or the ancient Sumerian term for the subterranean ocean that was the domain of the god Enki, the Abzu or Apsu. What is that connection again, and how then does that manifest in what we see in the culture that surrounded the ancient Israelites?
Well, the connective tissue there, of course, is with the Jewish concept of the underworld, which is usually Sheol, and a lot of translations of the Old Testament have gotten better about, I think, rendering that as Sheol, and so there is this connection between the way that it's usually translated in Hebrew is as the word Rephaim, not Abzu, but the word Rephaim, of course, as you know, is generally translated as wraiths or ghosts or dead ones or something of that sort. And so there's this clear connection to the underworld. And when you consider that this is likely a borrow word of a kind, or at least a share word from the ancient Near East or other parts of the ancient Near East like Mesopotamia, then in much the same way that we make analogy between the Watchers and the Apkallu and the Nephilim and the Anunnaki, then you can make similar analogies and comparisons between those words and concepts. So the connective tissue there gets really interesting when you begin to dig into, as you well know, the Akkadian material and the Ugaritic material, both of which allude to this place which you guys wrote about in Veneration, and did an excellent treatment of. This place it's more than just a closet to stow dead spirits and write lyric poetry about. It's this place where the ancestor kings, these god kings, went to after they expired, and both the people of Mesopotamia and the people in Canaan and Phoenicia believed that they had a duty to revere, but also placate and draw power from these long dead ancestor kings. And that gets fleshed out in greater detail, of course, in the Ugaritic material, where you get a sense of the funerary cults that existed that perform this very function.
The Abzu, the Apsu, there seems to be a connection there to a ritual pit that is first attested at the city of Urkesh. This was an ancient Hurrian city in what is now northern Syria, very far northeastern Syria, just across the border from Turkey, and apparently occupied a key location along that route that led through a pass up to this Transcaucasus region to the north, sort of a trade route from the mountains to the north, which were sources of minerals, precious metals like silver, and the Mesopotamian markets to the south. So the Hurrians basically sat a city right there. It was sacred, according to texts that have been found by the Italian husband and wife archaeologists Giorgio Bucciolati, and I'm going to forget his wife's name, but it's Kelly Bucciolati is her surname. They've been working there since about 1995, and they've determined that this is was the center for the worship of the god Kumarbi, and Kumarbi is a cognate, a different name for the same entity of the Sumerian god Enlil, the Canaanite god El, Greek Kronos, Roman Saturn, Phoenician Baal-Hamon, same entity, different name. The Amorite Dagon, same god, different name. But the worship involved having to descend into a ritual pit that was dug into the ground. I mean, deep into the ground, 20, 30 feet. They've not reached the bottom of it yet. I think they've got 20 feet to go yet, according to the most recent papers I've read by them, which, of course, their research has been interrupted by the Syrian civil war, sadly. Mm-hmm. This pit was called the Abi. Now, again, this is Hurrian, not Akkadian or Sumerian, so neither Semitic or whatever the Sumerians were, because scholars don't really agree on what they were. They just know that their language was unique and didn't come from any of these other strains. Is there an etymological connection between this ritual pit of the Hurrians, where they had to summon their chief god Kumarbi from the underworld, which is, I think, significant to what we're talking about here and relevant, and the Abzu or the Apsu of Enki at Eridu. And in a broader sense, then, the Semitic word meaning father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. That's something that I had not considered. I had not considered the Hurrian element. That's going to take some more work on mine.
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons I found this so fascinating, because you've got this connection here. If it's Proto-Indo-European, and you see these waves of migration coming from the Transcaucasus culture to the south, they would have gone right through this region, which is why the Hurrians set up shop there at Urkesh, and had where they had this cult center to their chief god of the underworld, occupying the same slot in the pantheon as Kronos of the Greeks. Kumarbi was later pushed out of the kingship by the storm god Teshub, just like Zeus deposed Kronos, and Marduk took over for Enlil. It was the same situation there. So you've got not just the shared memory of the god kings, the Rabaum, the Rapayuma, the Rephaim. You've got this memory that there once was this old god who's now in the underworld, but the means for contacting the other word that seems to be etymologically linked, and there's some scholarly basis for this, is the word that's translated medium in 1 Samuel, ov.
Which would be ov, yeah.
So, and there are some who believe that might be the Semitic or the Hebrew word for the ritual pit from which you summoned the Elohim, the spirits that occupied the unseen realm.
Wow. Yeah, certainly had not considered the Hurrian angle, and now you've really got my mind reeling with the reference to Ob, which is recurrent in a number of places in the Old Testament.
Sure, and you see it in a variety of forms. Avi, A-B-I, Avu, or Abu in the different languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Ugaritic, and Akkadian, connected again possibly through this Semitic root with the R followed by a vowel morpheme that you outline and in your paper. It seems to point to this milieu in the ancient world that all, but I think where your paper adds an important piece to this puzzle is show a common source there in the Transcaucasus.
Yeah, I mean, I was shocked. Again, the clincher for me was really two parts. It was sort of backtracking this into the Proto-Indo-European heartland, but also the recurrence of this R vowel morpheme in languages that, some of them are not spoken anymore. Most of them are, and they're all traced back to this region in the Eurasian continent. And again, we can go over some of these words here in a moment. I've mentioned a few of them, but by using the same mathematics, a sort of algorithmic approach that linguists use to reconstruct Proto-Semitic and Proto-Indo-European, it's not inconceivable that there was a shared proto-language before these. And when you begin to ponder that, and even in the consideration of just the words that we've talked about today between the Semitic or ancient Near Eastern world and the Indo-European world, when you plug in the biblical worldview, humanity speaking one language or one family of languages with mutually intelligible dialects and pidgin languages and things like that, then the Tower of Babel account begins to take on the hue of a greater reality and possibility.
Right. So some of these other languages, you've mentioned a few. What are some of the more surprising connections that you found as you were cataloging these derivations from this original morpheme?
Well, every one of them was just a surprise, because I just kept, I would do a search and I would run into another one, and then I would run into another one. It was just one after the other, like a row of dominoes. And I really started I branched out from the ancient world. I continued there. I looked at what the Mediterranean had to offer. Of course, the Greek example that you referenced a moment ago. But what's also interesting is that in Linear A, the sort of Proto-Greek that was spoken by the Minoan civilization, we have a reference to King Minos of Labyrinth Minotaur fame. And again, I think it's the Phaistosthios that this is on, but it's at any rate, whatever the provenience, the text reads Ruja Mina for King Minos. So there again, you have the R morpheme, vowel morpheme. And we've already mentioned Rex in the context of Latin, but even later language groupings, such as the Celtic languages of the British Isles, which I found thoroughly fascinating. The Irish Gaelic word for king is ri. The related Scottish Gaelic word for king, is ri. Manx, which is another Celtic language, the word is ri.
Mm-hmm.
And in Welsh, it's brenin. So you still, although it's not initial, and you can play a little hard and fast with the B there, that R vowel morpheme is contained in the Welsh as well. And of course, the Romance languages, which are descendants of Latin, Spanish, we have re, French, re, in, let's see, Basque, which is an Iberian tongue, rega. You have in Italian, it's re as well. And as I said, English retain, although we use words like king, because English began as a Germanic language, essentially. The words in like Scandinavian tongues like Kennig is where we get king. But after the Norman conquest, English, or Anglo-Saxon at the time, was Latinized by the French that was brought over by the Normans. And that's why we have words like regal and royal.
Mm-hmm.
And
you got the surname that was applied to the illegitimate sons of the kings, Fitzroy, son of the king.
Yeah. Exactly. So again, just a cursory look at this thing gives you an amazing. Galician is another one, Ray. And then throughout the Slavic tongues, you have a number of similar constructs. They're usually preceded by a very marked K sound, but you still have the R vowel morpheme within them. It's usually some variation of crawl or kraj or krolju. So you find this littered through languages like Croatian and Serbian, Ukrainian. The Azerbaijani word, interestingly enough, is very similar to that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
Polish, Slovenian. It's all through Eastern Europe.
It's all through Eastern Europe and Western Asia,
Mm-hmm.
West Central Asia, and all of the South Asian and Southeast Asian languages, which were affected by the spread of Hindu, and therefore the language of Sanskrit, whether it's Hindi or Nepalese or Burmese, or even some of the islands off the coast of Southeast Asia, like Indonesia and Java, and their words are for king are some variation of Rajan or Raja. In the Philippines, the word is hiri. Now, I'm not sure if that's a Tagalog or one of the other native tongues, but we do know that the Philippines, of course, were affected by Hindu culture as well. There was influence there. So just this smattering, survey, and I included the best ones, the best case scenarios in the paper that I think were the best case scenarios for comparison. I was really taken aback, quite frankly. And to me, this was not only linguistically fascinating, but it was disturbing too, because it points to a kind of cultural engineering or manipulation on the part of certainly the Rephaim, but by proxy, the Watchers and the Giants, which we have a really clear picture of in the apocryphal literature.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that really surprised me here is the indigenous name of Easter Island, according to some ethnographers. What was that, and how does that connect?
Well, Easter Island is interesting. Of course, my analysis is largely focused on the languages of Europe and Asia, but you do find some interesting things beyond the scope of Eurasia. And Easter Island is another one of those. The place name the indigenous place name of Easter Island is Rapa Nui, and some ethnographers believe that this is also the name for the people, and it means great one.
Uh-huh.
Now, when you consider that Easter Island is littered with the relics of their ancestor god king cult, the Moai, it becomes very interesting as well. And there are a number of place names on the island that are also phonetically similar to the Anakim, such as Anakina Beach.
Yeah, I see that on the map here, which you point out in your paper based on the work of E.C.B. McLaurin, a paper that, again, we find this paper, this information has been out there for a long time. Contrary to what we've been taught, Anakim does not derive from a Semitic term that means long necks. It's a Proto-Greek term that means high king. That's right.
Now, this would have been the Linear B material the Mycenaeans spoke. So, yeah, you're right. And I highly recommend that paper, people who are interested in this.
So fascinating stuff, considering that Easter Island is in the Southeast Pacific. It's a territory of Chile, so it's nowhere near the Middle East, relatively isolated. But what conclusion do we draw from this then as far as the wide spread of these terms, everywhere from the British Isles to the South Pacific?
Well, what we draw from this is one more piece of the puzzle. This is one more piece of evidence that not only were the giants and the watchers real, but the Bible is true.
That sums it up very nicely. I don't think we can really go anywhere from there. But this is why I find archaeology so fascinating, and why this appears to be the calling to which we've been led. And our good friend Dr. Doug Hamp, who I know has got some fascinating work coming out in his forthcoming book. We look forward to seeing that in print. Where do people read your paper? Is this going to be available for public for the public?
Absolutely. I've made it available as a download for $3.99, and people can go to my Facebook page. They can go to Twitter. They can go to Burton Beyond or the Institute website, and I'll have some ways that they can get to it. But I've had good response so far. People have been really interested in getting a hold of the paper, and I wanted to, I suppose I could have gone the academic route and published this, but I felt that it was too important, and I wanted to get it out to people. So that's why I've made it available as a PDF download.
All right. Well, we'll put a link in the show notes to Judd's website. It's burtonbeyond.com, and I'll link specifically to the paper so you can download it. $3.99, very affordable. It's very readable. It's 11 pages, so it's not going to take you a ton of time to read, but the information is packed in here, and it's accessible, fascinating, and a missing piece of the puzzle. But that's all we're doing, is just trying to assemble these little puzzle pieces one at a time. My next book is going to spend quite a bit of time dealing with the ritual pit of Kumarbi at Urkesh. And now, because of this, I'm going to have to delve into this subject as well, and the connection between the Proto-Indo-European origins of the term for the Rephaim, the Rabaum, the Repaiuma, the Rephaim, the great ones, because they're, again, contrary to what we've been taught, Rephaim in the Bible does not really mean healers. There may be in some context a belief that if you appease them, they might do something for you, but I don't think that's the origin of the term.
No.
So, well, Judd, thanks very much for sharing this with us, and we look forward to seeing you. Now, you've got a forthcoming book. Can you talk about that yet, and give us an idea as to when we can expect that?
Yeah, it's we're co-authoring with Dr. Aaron Judkins, mutual friend of ours, and it's about Göbekli Tepe and the Bible. And a lot of this material I'm talking about right now intersects with, because we're talking about basically the southern edge of the Proto-Indo-European heartland.
Right.
We're almost done with the manuscript. I keep finding it's probably my fault, but I keep finding new material. Like it's like my committee chair on my PhD committee said. He said, you just have to stop writing your dissertation. You never come to a closing point.
Well, that's the thing Sharon and I keep finding, because shortly after we finished Veneration, there was stuff that's like, oh man, if we had only known. Things connected to the dolmens and the dolmen fields around the Sea of Galilee. It's like, if we'd known. But at some point you have to say stop and turn it in, which is why it's a good thing Tom Horn gives us deadlines. And so, okay, well, all right, well, this will go in the next book then. So we got something left for the next one. Well,
Oh man translates to sequel, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, we look forward to that. Göbekli Tepe, one of the fascinating sites on planet Earth, and Dr. Judd Burton, Dr. Aaron Judkin's forthcoming book on that subject. We'll definitely have you guys on to talk about that. Judd, thanks again. We look forward to the next time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Derek.
And we thank you for watching. Hang on, some final thoughts and more as A View from the Bunker continues.
Where were you on 10/13? As the Middle East erupts in chaos, a devastating wave of terror shocks the nation. Thousands lie dead. An apocalyptic Christian cult is blamed. And suddenly, believers disappear as internment camps spring up almost overnight. Meanwhile, a deadly virus spreads. A desperate country demands answers, and only a few dare ask, what's in the vaccine? FBI Special Agent Joe Eunice follows a trail of evidence to a small town in Iowa and a young boy who received a mysterious email from God. Now, racing against time, Agent Eunice finds himself working side by side with reclusive internet broadcaster Barney Eisen. Together, they discover a disturbing truth at the center of the conspiracy. They wrestle not against flesh and blood. The God Conspiracy, a novel by Derek P. Gilbert. Get it now in paperback and Kindle. From Rose Avenue Fiction.
Driving the internet to think every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net, on social media, Twitter @ViewFromBunker or @Derek Gilbert, as long as they'll allow me to stay. Also on Parler, as soon as that's back up online, MeWe, and on Gab as well now. Gab, a Twitter substitute. And actually, I like the interface there better than on Twitter. Not as many ads, for one thing, and a little more freedom to say what you think. You'll find my handle at all of those, Parler, MeWe, and Gab, Derek P. Gilbert. The easiest way to get the audio version of the podcast every week is with the free mobile app. We have a free View from the Bunker mobile app for iOS and Android devices. You'll find the links to the App Store and the Play Store in the right-hand column at VFTB.net. Just download it, and every time we upload a new program, you'll get it right on your smartphone or tablet. We're actually going to be traveling a little bit. Just a month away from conference season starting up again and actually being able to travel, because there are some parts of the country where that's still allowed, surprisingly enough. We got a virtual conference next weekend, though. Sharon and I busy on finishing up our presentations and getting them uploaded for the virtual conference hosted by Pastor Paul Begley, the Virus, Vaccines, Victims, and Victory virtual conference. That's February 5th and 6th. Stream it from the comfort and safety of your own home. Sharon and I, of course, putting together presentations. Pastor Paul Begley, who's always a dynamic speaker. You can find out more and sign up online at his website. I'll be talking about the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum's cunning plan to completely rethink capitalism for the world. Isn't it interesting, and isn't it kind of these billionaires who are behind this plan to decide that it's time to be more inclusive with capitalism? I somehow don't think that their understanding of the word inclusive when it comes to capitalism is the same one that you and I might think of. But we'll be talking about the prophetic implications of that, and Sharon will be talking about spiritual warfare. So don't miss this. You can find out more and sign up at paulbegleyprophecy.com, paulbegleyprophecy.com. Then the first weekend in March, this will be our first live in-person conference in a year, literally a year, because it was the first weekend in March last year. that Mike Kerr and Jeannie Moore of Hear the Watchman hosted their conference in Dallas, and that was the last time, essentially, that we traveled last year, with the exception of the Warrior Retreat that Jamie Walden hosted. But as far as conferences go, Hear the Watchman, the first weekend of March 2020, was our last in-person conference, but March 4th through 7th of this year, we will be in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, just south of Nashville, for the Decoding the Supernatural Conference, hosted by Pastor Jeff Jansen of Global Fire Ministries. Jeff and Jan Jansen hosting us there at their church. We'll be there with L.A. Marzulli, Sharon and me, and L.A. Marzulli basically doing most of the speaking. Jeff may talk, but says he may just decide to MC the event. Either way is fine, but you can find a schedule online and more about the location, how to get there, local accommodations, and so forth at their website, which is globalfireministries.com. That's globalfireministries.com. Then speaking of Hear the Watchman, their Dallas conference at this point is still a go. That's March 19th through 21st at the Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center. This has become one of our favorite annual gatherings, and we pray that this will hold true. I mean, Murfreesboro is a little more like the Ozarks, and that we've got a little more freedom to move about here than many other places in America and around the world, especially bigger cities. So we're hoping that this comes off. March 19th through 21st, the Hear the Watchman Conference, Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center. Find out more online at hearthewatchmen.com. We've also committed to being a part of the Future Vision 2021 conference from Prophecy Watchers. That'll be in June at the Marriott in Colorado Springs. You'll find out more online at prophecywatchers.com, and we'll have more as we get deeper into the year to tell you about. Of course, the Skywatch TV Israel tour, which had been scheduled for April, has been moved back to October because of questions about the ability to travel. This weekend, in fact, the airport in Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion Airport, is just reopening after a 2-week complete shutdown. No air travel in or out, even domestically. So Israel is shut down, and I see in the news this weekend that the governments in Australia and New Zealand are saying that they may shut down until 2022. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we're hoping and praying that October will be conducive to travel to Israel, and our friend Aaron Lipkin is looking forward to, seeing visitors once again, since travel is his business, but also because, like us, he's an archaeology nerd, and we miss going to those sites and that connection with the Holy Land. If you want to find out more and reserve your place, if it turns out that travel is not possible in October, you will not be liable for any deposit or anything like that. Aaron is a good man. You can trust him. So you can find out more at the website, skywatchinisrael.com, skywatchinisrael.com. Appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen wherever you're consuming this content, and appreciate it if you get a spare moment to leave us a review. Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, wherever fine podcasts are sold. And give us a like on Facebook, the Facebook page there for the podcast. Our announcer is DC Good, and A View from the Bunkers, a production of Gilbert House, released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 international license. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.